would like to invite our next speaker, Professor John Adams, to give his talk titled The Role of Knowledge Management in Achieving Efficiency, Effectiveness, and Value for Money in the Public Sector. Professor John, please take the floor.
ازيك؟ Yeah. Good, good. Okay. Well, this morning I want to talk about a very different subject from the previous talk, but it is connected. And it's also connected to the talk from, I think it was Dr. Peter from the United Nations yesterday, and Helen Gilman from IFAD regarding knowledge management. Now, the focus of my talk is not knowledge management. It's value for money in the public sector. But when Professor Alam asked me to come here, I had to think long and hard, how do I integrate value for money, or VFM, into knowledge management? And in fact, it's a difficult thing to do, but it is essential, and it's becoming more and more important. Now, just to give you some background, the concept of value for money began in the public sector. It basically started about 320 years ago in something called the National Audit Office of the UK government. The National Audit Office was the first ever government department to be created, and its job was very simple: to make sure that taxpayers' money was protected. Not only protected in terms of not being stolen, but also protected in the sense that, is the money being used properly? Taxpayers' money is not like shareholders' money. If I have shares in IBM and it goes down, too bad, bad luck. But as a taxpayer, I have a share in how the government spends my money, and I expect it to spend it wisely and not to waste it. That's the background to value for money. A lot of people tend to see it as a kind of nebulous concept, but in fact it's not. We can calculate if we are getting value for money. It involves a lot of calculations, very precise calculations, and it does work. So, the theme of the conference is digital revolution, smart cities, etc. But to have a smart city, you really need smart public sector organizations to manage these cities, whether at the local level in administration or at the national level. Now, the question is, how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be in terms of being smart? Well, where are we in 2017? In terms of public sector organizations across the world, some are better at creating value for money, some are very, very bad. So where are we now? Well, before I start to explain where I think we are, let me give some background to this. Most of you, if you've came from a business or a management background, will probably have heard of Peter Drucker. Now, Peter Drucker, from an academic point of view, has always been considered the arch enemy of government. As far as Drucker was concerned, government should govern but not do. Leave the individual, leave the private sector to do things. Just make sure that you have the legislation and the regulation and the environment in place that allows them to do it instead of stopping them to do it. Now, Drucker's argument is not supported by a lot of people, has not been supported by a lot of people. However, what he said in the 1970s, 80s, 90s started to come back. And what we're seeing, I think, in the last 10 years is not so much an acceptance of Drucker's point of view by academics, but an increasing acceptance of Drucker's point of view by the general public. And that goes part of the way to explain what has happened around the world in the last 10 years as far as the general public is concerned. Basically, big government is no longer trusted. And that is a fundamental problem. Now, Drucker is not the only one. Drucker was a management specialist, but in fact, before Drucker, in the 1970s, we had economists discussing these issues. In particular, the work of Gordon Tullock. Now, Gordon Tullock argued that if someone's household garbage can be taken away for $50 in one part of New York, why is it costing $2 in the next district? What is going on? It's the same job, it's the same public service, but it's costing 4 times as much. Why is that? The same type of worker, the same technology, the same equipment. The one difference is the public administration of that service. And that's a question the general public keep asking themselves. Why am I paying all of this money when down the road they're paying half for the same service? So, what we have to ask ourselves is, what has this led to? This increasing questioning of what government or local government or a public sector agency actually does. Increasing criticism, not just from academics, but more importantly, from the general public. Well, where are we? As far as I'm concerned, we do have an increasing rejection of big government all around the world. And alongside that, the rise of so-called populism, people reacting in a negative way to being told what is good for them, and they're fed up with it. And we see that recently at the US election in November. We've seen it in the UK with Brexit. We almost seen it in France. That was a bit of a saviour, but how long that will last, we don't know. We've seen it across the Middle East and North Africa in a number of countries, Latin America, even in parts of China, Spain, Italy, Egypt. There are calls in Egypt for independence amongst 1 or 2 regions of Egypt. This populism is spreading. So, along with that, a rejection of globalization. Even politicians, senior politicians, are beginning to see that globalization is not the panacea that everybody expected. So, basically, the general public in many, many countries across the world do not have the trust in local or national government or public sector organizations that they did have just 10 years ago. And that's a problem. It's a problem because it can lead to the kind of things like Brexit or to extremist politics all around the planet. It's a very, very serious problem. So, how do we reverse it? One of the fundamental problems with this rejection of big government is the gap between what the public get and what they were promised or what they expected. Whether it's education, for example, your 7-year-old goes to school, you expect him, on day 1, you expect him to come home with some books. He doesn't. because the school doesn't have the books. So why are you paying this tax? Something as simple as that. You go to hospital, the medicine's not there. If any of you saw the news this morning, Venezuela, that's exactly what's happening in Venezuela right now. The public services have collapsed because the money is not there and the general public are asking, okay, where is it? What happened to my money? And that's a fair question. So, can this be reversed? I think yes. If government, and increasingly in Europe especially, they're starting to recognize this, start to pay attention to what people actually want and not what they think they need. Because that's been the fundamental problem for far too long. And that way, value for money is likely to be assured. This is, I don't know, you probably can't read that from there. But this is the concept and application of value for money in the UK. This is the latest version from the National Audit Office. It's their job basically to inspect, like the UN inspection agents, to inspect what public sector organisations actually do with taxpayers' money. And you can see at the bottom the economy, efficiency and effectiveness, the 3 E's. There is a 4th E that is not always applied, it's equity. Equity in public service. But economy, efficiency and effectiveness, those are the key ones. Economy means opportunity cost. If you spent $2 million on a kidney machine for a hospital, what else could you have spent those $2 million on? Maybe on medicine. Well, it depends. How many kidney patients are in your hospital district? 2. Oh, I see. So you've got 2 patients, $1 million each. How many school books could that have purchased? That's the opportunity cost. The efficiency is, have you bought the most efficient machines? How do you know they are the most efficient? And effectiveness simply means, do they do what they're supposed to do? For example, in the United States, efficiency in hospital care is measured in terms of bed turnover rate. How many patients go through the same bed in 24 hours or 48 hours? You see? And if it's a high number, then it's efficient. But if it's 10 patients in 48 hours, that's efficient. If 9 of them go to the morgue, it's not effective. So that's the problem. We can be efficient with public services. It doesn't mean we're being effective at all. So, this idea of value for money revolves around these 3 fundamental concepts: economy, efficiency, and effectiveness in everything that any public sector organisation does. And it's the process part of the VFM system where knowledge management can become very, very important. Because one of the major problems in public sector organisations is the loss of experienced staff. They are the ones who know how the systems work. They are the ones who understand the concept of value for money. If they leave or are transferred to another government department, the knowledge in that particular department is depleted, especially if no mentoring of new recruits or younger staff is done. So, we have to be smart. What does that mean? It means that we have to be able to be specific with targets. How many school children should be getting their O-levels, for example? That's a target. We have to be able to measure it. So it has to be measurable. We have to agree on these targets, and they need to be realistic. If government or any public agency, or even a private company, sets targets for its staff that are unrealistic, the staff will react negatively to that. If they are not part of the agreed targets, the work will simply not be done properly. And it has to be timely. We have to put strict time limits on achieving things. All of this doesn't guarantee, but it's more likely to lead to value for money for the taxpayer. Now, I know in Bahrain, many people do not pay tax. Is that correct? But you might be paying tax in the next 6 months, 12 months, because the government is discussing the introduction of value-added tax. Now, this links back to something that Professor McQuaid said. Value-added tax was introduced in Egypt just 6 months ago for the first time ever. It was introduced to replace the sales tax, but applied at a higher rate on different goods and services. It has meant an increase in the amount of tax that Egyptians have to pay. Egypt is also restructuring its income tax, its company tax, to increase the tax base. Now, why? Because the tax base itself is not big enough. The demands on the government, the public demands, are becoming stronger and stronger, and they, quite frankly, do not have the money. They can't keep borrowing. No government can keep borrowing, so they have to get the money from the taxpayer. That is becoming an increasing issue across the world, and one of the reasons, in the longer term, is because of what Professor McQuaid referred to, demographic change. In Northern Europe, China, much of Latin America, the population is getting older, the workforce is getting smaller, so we're going to have an increased demographic burden ratio on those who are in work. In the Middle East and North Africa and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the population is actually staying relatively young or getting younger. But the problem with that is the number of jobs available. And if unemployment relative to the younger population keeps rising, which it is likely to do, then the tax base keeps falling. That also puts pressure on governments to raise taxation. Now, all of that means the purpose of delivering public service is to make sure that value for money is delivered with it. One way of helping that process is the introduction of knowledge management systems into public sector organizations in a way that complements achieving value for money. Now, one of the fundamental requirements to connect knowledge management and value for money is a proper and an agreed performance management system. We cannot expect people to perform, to achieve targets which they are not part of agreeing to. Otherwise, it's unreasonable. We won't be able to do it. Oops. Just go back. So, what is the impact of integrating these two ideas? We get consistency between public sector organizations, comparability between them. We can measure what they're doing and what they're not doing. Clarity of objectives, which is a big issue, especially if you're losing staff. And most important is the existence and the elimination of subcultures within public sector organizations, where one department doesn't talk to another department, where people in the same department don't talk to each other. They are not sharing knowledge at all. They think knowledge is power, so they keep it to themselves. That's a disaster. And it all comes down to trust. I'll very quickly explain. The existence of vertical and horizontal trust in public sector organizations is a must. It also raises the issue of in economics, the classic principal-agent problem, but I don't have time to go into that. But certainly, this question of vertical and horizontal trust is very important. In this diagram, you can see in the left-hand bottom corner, that's an organization that is completely dysfunctional. Nobody trusts anybody. In 2007, a good example from the UK was the Passport Agency. The Passport Agency basically collapsed. Nobody would speak to anybody who worked in the Passport Agency. The bosses wouldn't speak to the workers wouldn't speak to each other. It collapsed. The top right hand is ideal. I have trust in my boss trusts me, I trust my colleagues. But it's extremely rare. That's the problem. The top left and the bottom right, here we have the possibility of enabling knowledge management to be implemented into public sector organizations, but only if the little cliques, the little subcultures that exist in these organizations can somehow be eliminated, either by incentives or disincentives. And for that, we need good succession planning, we need continuous training of staff, we need intensive training of new staff, continuous job rotation, but not short-term, medium-term, so that the knowledge is actually retained, and continuous reinforcement of the purpose of a public sector organization. Its objective, its service level agreements, I haven't mentioned those yet, but basically every public sector organization must have service level agreements in which they are achieving a particular level of service which the public expect to see. That will help deliver value for money. And all of this is measurable. There's hundreds of calculations behind these things. It is measurable, it is doable. Government is increasingly seeing that it can be done, and it should be done, and if they deliver value for money to the public, then maybe public trust can be restored. And this is how it should work. We should see over time an improvement in value for money, and you'll see in the knowledge management axis, the dip below the x-axis. That's depletion of knowledge. People are leaving. And then it builds up. Thank you. This diagram, over time, it should be the purpose, for example, of the finance ministry in Bahrain, the finance ministry in the UK, to follow that path, to be increasing value for money, usually with less money, becoming more efficient. And at the same time, retaining and expanding the knowledge of how they do that within the organization. Ideally through succession planning, where senior people are retiring or they might be leaving for whatever reason, and that becomes a critical part of the knowledge management system. Then in the next stage, it's improved again, and continuous improvement. Because after the 2008 financial crisis, I personally think the global economy is on a different track. We're no longer in the good old days of positive GDP growth, and everybody was confident in the future. Things have changed much more fundamentally than just what happened to the banks. The whole view of the global economy has changed. And personally, I think nobody really knows where it's going. We have all these forecasts, all these predictions. Nobody really knows. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your good presentation. Actually, regarding how to measure the performance. Actually, now is a KPI, key performance
Yes.
indicator, is the most good measure for every sector, even the public sector or private sector, and has been implemented. It is fair, and it has all the items of the performance.
Yeah.
So the problem of performance management, I think, is solved by KPI, and it consists of two: one the items of the performance, and one is the peer, 360 degree. So I think this is very, very, very efficient and can show the efficiency, and can show the effectiveness, and can show the sustainability of the performance of the individuals and organization.
Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting question. Yes, I've heard this before. Key performance indicators already have solved the problem of efficiency and effectiveness, but I'm not convinced by that. For example, if you take a civil servant working in his or her office, okay, one of the KPIs used in the UK is the number of times the waste paper basket is emptied during the day. So, if he fills up the waste paper basket 10 times, it's emptied 10 times, is that because he's being really efficient, or is it because he doesn't know what he's doing? You see? Again, the hospital example in the US.
Now it's paperless. Everything now is online.
No, it's not. In many, many countries, including the UK, paper still dominates a lot of things. And the example of healthcare, you know, very efficient, but you're dead. That's not effective. So the KPIs only matter if they have been properly thought out and if they are measuring what they're supposed to. It's like the Global Happiness Index. What is it measuring? Is it measuring happiness or misery? Well, it depends on your point of view.
Okay, because for the sake of time, I have two requests I cannot say no to. Dr. Saira and Najat Bouhlega. Saira, but please.
No, thank you very much, and I think just value for money works, should work for the public sector as well, because the global crisis were not government, in part. The second thing is, it's interesting what you said. This is more like a comment, but please answer about the changing government and how people feel about governments and big governments. But if there are separation calls in Egypt, there is also in the UK.
Yes.
So I think economy is a driver for all of this. So in part, government failed us, but also economists and your average worker had failed us as well. Extremism is everywhere in the world. We can debate who created extremism in the Middle East, but it's also existing in America. With the police force shooting black people, with no offenses, and so on. So it's just something that, as the economy fundamentally is changing, I think identity of human race is changing, and at all sorts of levels.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, again, it comes back to something Professor McQuaid said. Current graduates and future graduates are not just different from us when we graduated. They've got a much more uncertain future. And I know when I graduated, I had the choice of 4 or 5 jobs. But now, in Egypt, for example, a lot of our graduates cannot find any job at all. Never mind a graduate level job. But the government continues to pump out the graduates. Of course, they would argue it keeps the unemployment rate down, but only for 4 years, you see? And yes, the economy is probably the most basic underlying issue, because you have many, many people in the labor force feel completely separated from society. I mean, Brexit is a good example. The view there was not so much big government in London, it was big government in Brussels. Somebody in Brussels deciding that someone in the north of Scotland on the Atlantic coast was going to lose their job. You see? So these kind of things, and the local politicians don't have enough power to stop these things, which is another issue altogether.
The alternative for no government.
Pardon?
What is the alternative for no government?
Oh, no.
For the sake of time, I have to, because we're really running late. So I promise Najat Bouhlega, please.
Assalamu alaikum. I really enjoyed your presentation and your beautiful remarks. One thing that I feel that we need to have more trust in our employees. We will have value for money if we trust our youngsters and we train them, as you said,
yes,
to do their job better. Mm-hmm. And if we are gonna have turnover of the elder and have more professionals who are more trained.
Yes.
Because unfortunately nowadays, الواسطة, and you know vitamin Y, you know what it is, you know that that's what it works.
Yes, yeah. I know.
So we need to have more than that in
Yes.
order to have value for money.
Yes.
And I would like to have you respond how we can get rid of this. How can we change the working environment to be more trusting in our youngsters and have also our youngsters be ready for the job? Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. Quickly. How do we do it? I honestly do not know. What I do know is that the older generation, people like us, right, really need to give younger people more room to express themselves, to give their opinions, and they need to be listened to. And I think this is a big problem, and it's a dangerous problem. Certainly in Europe, the youth feel they are not listened to at all. And that is a very dangerous issue. In the workplace, I think management needs to become more modern. They need to realize I cannot manage people if they resent me. And they will resent me if I order them to do something instead of explaining why it needs to be done. Absolutely.
Okay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Professor Abdallah Al-Hawaj, Professor Mansour Al-Ali, and Professor Alam Ahmed to please come on stage to reward our speakers with certificates of appreciation. Professor John Adam.